thank you to John Kania, Mark Kramer, and the team at FSG for making this whole concept, this whole thing possible. If they had not codified this idea, none of us would be in Aspen enjoying this beautiful weather. So let's just give them it's pretty phenomenal, right? I mean, all over the place, all over the country, people are talking about this idea that was put on paper. And so it's really exciting to have an opportunity to share with you the lessons we've learned, and then hear from some of our key partners nationally about the role that funders can play. And we really did do this on the fly. We just had a 3-hour session, pulled out some themes, and now we're going to present them back to you, and then we're going to give you all a little bit of time at your tables to reflect on those themes. We're then going to ask you to come up with a haiku that captures your table's insights. It's pretty exciting. That's another experiment we're going to do today. And then we're going to have our panelists reflect on what you saw as the most salient insights about the roles that investors can play in driving collective impact. I want to first just say to you all that after Paul's presentation last night and those incredible pictures that he put up there of me, I was very tempted to come in shirtless. And it was serious consideration, but you all would have been impacted collectively because you would have seen that and probably retched and then collectively run out of the room, which would have been great in some ways, but probably not worth our time. So it was very tempting, and I appreciated Paul's insights, but here are just a few things that we can say we have learned. First off, is it the difference between collaboration and collective impact, just in as tight a way as we can possibly explain it. We have initially been working with a group of over 100 communities that have said they're interested in this. We've worked directly with about 30. We bring that network together. And when we talked to them, it was clear that there's 4 key things. One is you're not bringing people together around programs or initiatives anymore. You're bringing them together around outcomes, right? You've got to figure out what the dials are you're going to move and figure out how you're together going to do that regardless if there's new money on the table. The next is use data to prove, not improve. Paul mentioned this last night. I think Amy Gadara of the Data Quality Campaign has the best way of talking about this, which is we're no longer using data as a hammer, but we're using it as a flashlight. And we're trying to figure out how we can shine a light on what works and do more of that. The next is it's not what you do, it's not in addition to what you do, but is what you do every day. Talk a lot about when I was working in a high school in Washington, D.C., and our principal would ask us about who wanted to be involved in a new collaboration, and everybody would try to run and hide. The reason was because they didn't want to have one more thing to do. They wanted to figure out how they could do what they're doing already better. And that's what collective impact should lead us to over time. And the last is we don't have to advocate for ideas anymore. We can advocate for what works. And that's possibly the most exciting thing because everybody in this room, in the communities they're working, can begin to have confidence that they know what it is that's moving the dial in their own backyard. It's wonderful to know what's happening elsewhere, but once you actually know what's happening in your own backyard, that's when we believe that you can begin to have this broad-scale collective impact. So with all of that in mind, we've worked over the last year and a half to build essentially a methodology that was intended to try to bring a bit more rigor to the field of collective impact. Our biggest fear is that this incredible concept will get watered down, right? And it was a head of a foundation at one point that said, if I see any more proposals about collective impact that are really just replacing collective impact for collaboration, we think we're going to be in trouble in the long run, right? Because it's not going to stand for anything significant. So we at first came up with this framework, and this is something that we developed way back in 2008 with the support of Living Cities, who began to help us think about what we were learning in Cincinnati and how we could codify that. And it essentially said there's these 4 pillars. There's the shared community vision. How do you get everybody to have individual and collective accountability for results? Evidence-based decision-making, how do you begin to agree on those outcomes and then connect work on the ground to what is moving the dial? Collaborative action, how do you get practitioners to use data every day? And investment in sustainability, how do you begin to fund that backbone or anchor entity? How do you mobilize resources behind what works? And how do you do the policy and advocacy work that's necessary? And this was good, and it helped communities get started. But they essentially said this was too high level. And we then developed a rubric where we broke down each of those little gray boxes into sort of what we thought the work would evolve to over time. But what the sites were telling us was they didn't capture the evolution of this work, and that there is some foundational work that has to be done first in order to build that culture and the trust needed to really get to systems change over time. So we worked with all these communities, and I'm going to show you something that somebody told me once is really a third date kind of document. You should never, Jeff, they said, share this on the first date, but I'm going to take a risk and throw it out there. It's this. I don't know what they're talking about. To me, this is the best first date ever, right? But on your table, you've got a copy of this. But essentially what they said is we want to keep the 4 pillars, they make sense to us, but there's some core principles like engaging the community, addressing disparities, developing a culture of continuous improvement, leveraging existing assets. That's the stuff way over there. You have to be thinking about that all the time. And this gets a lot to the adaptive and collective ownership work that needs to be done to make this happen. But then there's some developmental milestones over time related to each of those 4 pillars. Early on, there's the exploring milestones. Then emerging is when you're starting to talk a little bit more publicly about the outcomes and the data. Sustaining is when you're using data on the ground. And systems change is when you're actually mobilizing resources behind what works, and that's existing resources in addition to new resources. So all this to say, this gives us a frame. Now, somebody in the session this morning said, when I first looked at this, I literally had an allergic reaction, right? We could see the red flush across her face because it's a little bit complicated. But the bottom line, I think one of the things that we heard from the panelists yesterday, and particularly Patrick, was this is really complex work. And if we don't put a stake in the ground and say, okay, it is complex work, and we need to start figuring out what some of the evolutionary milestones might be in order to make this work happen, over time we're not going to really understand what's having a great impact. So right now we have a group of about 50 communities in our network that are at least in emerging and moving towards systems change. And our hope is that in a year this looks totally different because we're starting to collect lessons on what really is making a difference on the ground, and we can begin to lift up what actually works. Does that make sense? But within this, one of the things we know is that investors play incredibly important roles. And we are trying to use the term investor more than funder because we believe that there's this collective movement to going away from charity and more to an investment mentality. So we believe that there are incredibly important roles that investors can play, and they're different as you begin to go across the continuum. Early on, there may be certain things that investors can do, and down the line, they may begin to think about their role a little bit differently. So this morning, we had a series of panelists of folks that were in exploring, in emerging, onto sustaining and systems change. And we had these 3 amazing reflectors. That's what we called them. Isn't that a great name, by the way? Reflectors. That's what they are. And they're going to share back with us what they heard as some of the common themes. We're going to skip right through this because we want to get to you guys. All right? All right. So Wynn, what were some of the roles that you saw, or some of the themes that you heard on the role that funders can play in order to push folks towards systems change within that broader theory of action?
So the first is that investors need to adopt and appreciate a different mindset. So moving away from the we fund interesting projects and programs mindset, the 3-year grant cycle, to a different mindset. And at the beginning of that, though, whenever we're going to work in place, I think, and it came through this morning, we need to seek permission to come into communities. To bring these ideas and this way of working and not come in as the funder or the investor that has all of the answers, because we don't have the answers, but first seek permission from the leaders. Respect the local leaders, the local data, yet at the same time roll up our sleeves. And one of the things that came through is that our time and our knowledge and our networks are as important as the dollars that we bring. Also, we threw around this term long term. We're in it for the long haul a lot. We didn't define what that means, but for me, notionally, it means longer than that 3-year grant cycle. I think it means somewhere between 10 and 30 years worth of effort. Again, differentiated roles maybe for the funders over that time, balancing with that with the board, your board, our board's expectations that there be action and improvement. A patience for messy and complex work. And again, realizing that this isn't a project, it's really about solving a problem or focusing on those outcomes that Jeff mentioned. Another is that we must shift from our agendas to a community agenda, a shared agenda among a community of what is best for the community. Investing in leadership development at all levels, both in our organizations, because this is a different kind of work. Investing in our own organizations and our own personnel and human resources, and in those in the organizations with which we work. And then finally supporting the backbone function. and building that connective tissue that enables all of the work in a community to take place.
Excellent. So Doug, thoughts from you on what would you say are the key roles that investors can play?
Well, can I first say that I think this is so cool to have the cheat notes right
That's
here.
right.
So,
Yeah. Do you want me to turn it towards you, actually? Would that be helpful? Right, we're okay. All right, that's good.
It's great. It's great to be here.
Right.
Well, one of the things that really came through is this idea that building trust cannot be fast-tracked. And many of us here know of the great work of Nancy Zimfer when she was at the University of Cincinnati, and now she's at SUNY in New York, and we're so grateful to have her there. But she'll be the first to say this. In fact, she did say this. And so I think that was an important point that came out in the discussions this morning. But that also means being at the table but sitting at the back, but also at the same time realizing that balancing that notion with a point of view that is both respectful and thoughtful. So, you know, all of us come with a point of view, and it's important for us to be able to articulate what that point of view is, while at the same time being respectful and mindful of what's happening in the local context. And the other point that I thought was really interesting was this notion of redirecting existing funds. You know what's so cool about being here at Aspen is that every single time I come here, I get the opportunity to listen to a lot of people, and I think of something I hadn't thought about before. And when this was brought up this morning, I immediately thought about this notion of considering braided funding models, meaning really thinking about how do you design funding models that include the both public and private contributions and investments. Because the question of sustainability always comes up. It's important for us to be able to tap those public resources in our work in such a way that not only sustains the work long after the private money is gone, but most importantly, it seems to me, is that you have a direct conduit to systems and policy change, because that's what it really is about, right? We want to try to ultimately make systemic change in our work. So it's not 1,000 flowers blooming. It's how does this all kind of fit together to make substantive long-term change. So those are the things that I thought were kind of interesting, and was very, very happy to hear that coming out of the groups this morning.
Great. All right. Then Ryan, from Annie Casey, what were some of the insights that you had? Now, you had a unique job, first off, which was to say we were talking about education this morning. But was your sense that the lessons were applicable outside of education on the roles that funders can play?
The answer is yes. And it was focused on education, but I think with each of the panelists, the focus was much more around role, structure, lessons learned in a community or broader context. For me, applicable far beyond education. And in a lot of Casey's work, we tend to focus on neighborhoods, bringing in multiple sectors, and we find in the end we're concentrating on education as much as one that might start in that place.
Great. So a few of your insights.
Yeah, this process is magical. We talked about this an hour ago, and it appears here. We had time for lunch, and no cupcake, though. We'll have to get the cupcake.
We're going to get you a cupcake.
All right.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
So a few things. I think one was that all of the presenters talked about, when they talked about role, this role of a funder being a catalyst. And one thing I think that's interesting to consider is the nuance behind a catalyst. The difference between, say, catalyzing a movement, focusing on an issue, versus catalyzing or taking that energy and then bringing knowledge about an approach to take. And I think it's really important in many ways. The issues around sustainability, local ownership are perhaps determined right in that early stage if there isn't enough local involvement in getting behind a particular issue. Secondly, we talked a lot yesterday and this morning about the importance of forming relationships, the time that it takes in that exploring stage. One thing I think that became clear is that, as mentioned, this is complex work. And in order to take on complex work, it takes capacity, both the on-the-ground capacity of partners, but also the ability to use and share data. And that when we think about these early stages, the question came up, how do we know if we're ready? But that it's just important to make sure that relationships are strong, but there is a baseline degree of capacity to be able to execute once those relationships are formed. A third that resonated among the presenters was the role, the importance of funders in being able to both bring in lessons and best practices to a community, and then serving in many ways as a portal to share experiences with the broader field. One thing I think that's important in that and is complex is that in many times this is sharing lessons in real time, that we're not necessarily focused on when an initiative is over, we look back, we can share explicitly everything that happened. But for this to really be powerful, it's sharing in real time stuff that is still ongoing with many partners, often on work that's quite complex. And it takes a real deft touch to be able to share candidly but be respectful of an effort that's ongoing. And finally, something else that was discussed at length today and certainly yesterday and is, I think, refreshing for all of us is this real thoughtful approach to the how does a funder join? What is the role that a funder should play to add value, but not necessarily crowd out or cast too large of a shadow? It's the right conversation for us to be having, but my own personal thought, having spent a lot of time thinking about this, maybe even being a little obsessed at times, is that there's a risk in swinging too far the other way. That in being respectful of the community of partners, being deferential to a point where we're not necessarily bringing our full selves, adding value, and playing a part in holding all of the groups accountable for progress. So it's important to be sensitive, but also to bring our full selves to this work.
So we have some stuff, and we have a haiku.
Yay! Overachievers.
So the conversation really kind of focused on prioritizing relationships and leadership. And it kind of wandered a little bit, but kind of still around that, this idea of pace setting. And I kind of used the word decelerator, and it was reframed as a pace setter. But the idea that moving to work too quickly is actually not promoting the work if we don't have the relationships and trust to make it happen. Talking about kind of how we want to be in the work as opposed to just getting right to what are we going to do together. Kind of a space to offer honest reflection, especially amongst funders. So how do we get real with each other? Where are we falling short of how we want to be in the work? And also this idea that funders really could offer the space where that shared vision can start emerging. And so that's, did I miss anything or any? Okay, so to the haiku.
To the haiku.
Show me the money, and I'll bring you my program. We'll do it together.
You want to hand the mic to someone over here so they'll be ready, but we're going to go here first.
Some of what we discussed was similar, but I'm going to start with a haiku. Scanning horizon, many are the needs and gaps, cultivate balance. We talked about the role of a funder being a cultivator and being able to identify the capacity building needs, especially through adaptive leadership, but also through our knowledge of best practice, bringing and helping fill in the knowledge gaps, and sharing with that, and to identify even ideas where there's sometimes service gaps in places that we need to be investing in a future capacity that may not be identified yet, or there may not be a clear organization to fill the role.
Thank you. We're going to have one more and then reflection, and then we'll do another round. So we have someone who has the mic there.
So we focused on the haikus, and we have two, but I'll just read one. Catalyst and conveners, slow and steady wins race, risk equals reward.
Wonderful. We need to capture all, please turn in these haikus, by the way.
Good.
Is it turned on?
I'm sorry, we had, go ahead, and then we'll go back over here.
Okay, well, we couldn't remember what a haiku was, so we came up with the limerick.
Whoa, okay.
But we thought the role of funders was to help collect data and to share stories about the data. So here is our limerick. There once was a group of funders. Collective impact they thought was a wonder. They saw the value of data, and telling stories would care even greater, so collective impact would not go asunder.
Very nice, thank you.
So we also had a haiku. Candace, do you want to start with our haiku?
Okay. Jeff.
And to make sure that we understood what a haiku was, we remembered from our gifted programs, and then we cheated with our phone, so we think we're good. Non-sexy support, trust takes time, but it's worth it. Tend relationships. That would be our haiku.
Great. You have some comments also, right?
So coming back to this theme of tending a collective impact initiative, the idea of using influence as a convener to bring the right folks to the table, people of influence, also the importance of early investment, not even just sort of in capacity for a planning stage, but even the pre-work before that. It's not a very sexy time to invest in this work, but it's the critical work that sets this up for long-term success. It lets folks, when they finally do come together, have the right information, have the right people at the table, and build an early sense of momentum. The importance of, in the context of all of that, holding the long-term vision. And then finally, we talked about this earlier, but the importance of being at the table, rolling up your sleeves, not just with your resources, but with your time and with persistence.
Great. We'll pass the mics on, but I'd like to pause for just a second and hear any reflections on what you heard.
I just want to add one part to what you just said, which I did mention earlier, which I should have mentioned earlier, and that is the notion of it's so important to work in local communities where things have already existed, where there's already resources, where people have already come to the table. I use this term all the time, which I call philanthropic colonialism, which I don't think is a good approach. And so I think it's important that as funders, we're cognizant of those local circumstances and really honor the fact that people have already kind of come together to think about how they improve particular conditions and outcomes in their own communities, and just build upon that in partnership.
I could actually reflect and comment on, I think, everything that's been said so far, but the table that reported out, the word balance really resonates with me. I think there are so many things you have to balance in this work. And I made the comment about this isn't 3 years worth of work, it's something like 10 to 30 years worth of work. That doesn't mean that I'm not impatient. That doesn't mean that I or our board, and I think any of us, don't want to see results quickly. And so I think there are some things that you can do, though, in this that show those the quick wins. And so the example, Jeff, that you and I have talked about is FAFSA completion. We're in for the long haul. We just made a 5-6 year grant to support RGV Focus, the work in the Valley that Doug and I are in on, as well as the Meadows Foundation and Lumina, both of whom are represented here, both of which are. But we realized last February that FAFSA completion was below where it was the previous year. And in the Rio Grande Valley, where the per capita income is $12,500 versus the state average of $25,000, the FAFSA and the role of financial aid in college access is critical. In fact, the gap between the students who are eligible and don't complete the FAFSA is $23 million. So when that line compared to the previous year dipped below, so the real-time data that we're looking at came to our attention, within 30 days, we'd identified what the problem was. And by the way, no one from Dallas or Austin or College Station participated in that diagnosis. It was local leaders. The expertise was in the room to figure out what was going on when you brought K-12 and higher ed together. Within 60 days, a solution had been delivered across the entire 43,000 square miles, the 34 districts that represent about 400,000 K-12 students. And at the end, in May, we see a 3% increase in FAFSA completions because of a lot of work that was done from February to May or June. And so it is long-term work, but there are things that will happen because you have the right leaders using the right data, oriented around the right issues on a shorter-term basis. And so you can talk to your board about the things that are happening, and you'll have the data to do that.
I just add first, the poems were impressive. Maybe we can do theme songs the next. So just a couple of thoughts. I think one is, I'd echo what Doug said around relationships, leveraging existing relationships in these communities. At the same time, this needs to be something different, right? So and I think it's about who else comes to the table and emphasizing what is a different, fresh way of looking at a particular issue. This morning, there was a lot of talk about alignment of funders, and several folks mentioned that in many ways it's harder to align funders than to align with programs and partners. So it's just an important element, especially if we talk about then bringing in public funders as a sustainable source beyond. And then finally, around capacity, another thing that was raised was, although we tend to think about external capacity of partners, as was mentioned in terms of the complexity of this work, how long it takes, it's important to consider internal capacity, both of just the actual knowledge within a foundation, but also just culture and norms if there is a need to really shift the patience and the approach to this work.
And can I just add one little thing to what Ryan said? I think this issue of point of view and working together, I think, is important. And in examples at Ford and the communities that we're working with, one of the things we've asked them to at least consider is to think about how do you help improve college completion for particular populations such as immigrants and veterans incarcerated and the formerly incarcerated. They might not have necessarily thought about that before, but it's a point of view that we think is important, and it's been sort of weaved into the conversations and discussions in the communities that we're working with.
Influence then. Who has the microphone over here? There you go. Someone, can you hand it over here? And someone already has it over here?
Table 5 had it over.
Comment? There we go. Yeah, just this gentleman first, and then we'll pass it on. Yes, sir. Yes, please.
Hi. We ended up having a great conversation, and as we ended up thinking about this theory of change, we thought about systems change as the end in mind. And so if we knew that that's where we wanted to get to, we started to think about this whole idea of the public-private partnership. And what actually needs to be created within these communities to be able to help identify what we are uncovering, which are the successes and the potential barriers that we all face within these communities. And so if we can end up starting to help aggregate and synthesize all of the different insights that we learn at the local level, how do we then start to bring those together to then start advocating as we think about the public resources that are available to us as we go forward to create the long-term impact that we all want to see. And so fortunately we had Seth from the California Office of the Governor, who is deploying $180 million a year across community sustainability. So we started to talk about how do we end up contributing as philanthropy to the direction of where the state funds go. So that was the conversation that we had.
Great, great.
And we
Seth,
do have a great
haiku. Okay.
Okay. We do it all, but we have to change our culture to make social change.
Nice, thank you.
Can I just say that's amen to that? Amen to that. That's an inside joke. But both to the haiku and also what George said. See, I got so excited just listening to that. Speaking as a recovering policymaker, I'm always cognizant, as we all should be, in how we leverage public resources and how we build relationships and partnerships at the state and federal levels. So that's great for policy and systems change.
Great. Yes, sir.
Jeff, I apologize. We used the word funders rather than investors for the haiku only. Okay.
It's very upsetting. I'm just going to say that.
We like to keep him in a point of discomfort, so that's okay.
Funders at table, willing to give up control, flexible, patient.
Very good. Thank you. Others? Yes, ma'am.
We covered many of the things that have already been said, but we also talked about the ability to really be clear about how change does happen and about the ability to take risk, even accepting that you will fail at times and embracing that as a part of the learning process. And our haiku is connect the players, convene, be clear and take risk, build skills and leaders.
Okay. Thank you. I saw someone over here, yes? And then I'll pause.
We were so busy learning from each other that we didn't really talk about the haiku, but I'll offer this to my table mates. Iowa, Pittsburgh, Toronto, and Illinois, immersed with New York.
That's
pretty cool.
Great. Okay, one more over here. We're going to have some reflection. We have one over here. So we have a gentleman here and then over there.
Hi there. So one thing we talked about was just that role of catalyst versus role of igniter.
You know, and the idea that, Doug, I think it plays into a lot what you were talking about is there's work going on already, and where the, you know, where there's the efforts are there to build them and to jump in with the funding at the right time. So the haiku we have is, where there is stacked wood, kindling ready to ignite, we can feel the flame.
Ooh,
Nice.
wow, wow, wow.
Very nice and warm. Yes.
That's pretty good.
Hello. We had a great discussion over here, talking about pace and often creating the space for what's really needed in this work. So one, we forget about the role of base building institutions, and we need to invest in spaces to help develop community members and stakeholders of all types instead of just pushing them at the table singularly. We need to support glue and infrastructure to free up the time and resources to make this work. Our timelines as funders don't account for the time that it really takes to do this work. The public sector timeframe, often on an election cycle, which is both at the local level and the federal level, especially doesn't account for that time. And how can we create balance? We have to realize that we in this room that are leading this work are a drop in the bucket, and this ethic is still not enforced in other funding streams. And so what we discussed is, how do you play to the strengths and agree on the needs and wants of each sector? And so we have a proverb, which I reworked into a haiku because I'm competitive. So our proverb was the African proverb, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And so the haiku version of that is, if speed is the need, alone you should surely go. Impact takes friends, is slow.
Wonderful. Thank you. So while he was talking, when I saw you nodding your head, what was going through your mind as far as that?
A lot. I think the thing that most resonated with me was play to your strengths. And the thing that is different for me about collective impact is that we're not asking everyone to do the same thing. We're asking people to do what they're really good at, what are they really fantastic at, and how does that add up then into a whole against those outcomes that we're all trying to achieve. And so I think whenever you think about these differentiated roles and the mutually reinforcing activities, is how do you really get at what everyone can bring doing what they do really well, that all adds up to something that's much more than we could ever do alone.
Okay. Comments, Ryan?
Yeah, I like this igniter versus catalyst concept. And you know, I think as was mentioned, the importance of bringing in public funding, other funders, because the reality is, really in any community, philanthropic dollars are minuscule compared to a public system. So I think one is knowing, you know, how to deploy those in the most effective way. I think the other thing that might be interesting is to look at what's the right way to sequence local government, state government, other sources of funding and support. And for example, in our experience, we found that any citywide effort really cannot be successful if the mayor's office is not bought in. At the same time, many efforts that are initiated by a mayor don't last past that cycle. So what's the right way to bring in those forces in a way that is both leverages the full amount of funding, but also ensures the maximum sustainability?
Great.
And I just want to mention one other thing. First of all, I'm so happy that Seth and Michael are here, because they both represent a state and the federal government. And it'll be great as we continue to do this work together that we continue to engage people who represent those entities. And the last thing I want to say is that as we're thinking about this work, and I mentioned this in our meeting this morning, that we should also be thinking continuously about how are we building public and political will along the way? How are we actually investing in research, which really leads to developing compelling ideas and evidence? And how are we continuously thinking about investing in organizational capacity, which really gets to building an ecosystem that lasts, you know, beyond the term of a mayor or the term of a governor or what have you.
Great.
Another thing.
Absolutely.
You know, I think there's around this messaging, I think there's a real critical issue around expectations as well. And I think we're at a really interesting time where this movement is really robust and growing. Certainly concerned about this term collective impact getting watered down, perhaps. The other one, though, is at the same time generating enthusiasm and commitment is not expecting miracles to happen. You know, how do we build evidence? How do we create this movement? At the same time, knowing that ultimately for this to sustain, this needs to not be a fad, and there needs to be a, you know, a pretty sober look at how much can be expected over how long.
something that just occurred to me as Ryan was talking about the importance of the mayor's office. We have a different kind of reality in the Rio Grande Valley. We're working across 4 counties, 34 school districts, and about that many municipalities. So we couldn't have every elected leader at the table. So there's a role for the elected leaders, there's a role for the mayors, the county officials, but we're having to figure that out. And it's so that this is one of the places where context matters. And how do you figure that out in one place versus another, I think is really key.
Okay. I think with that, we'd like to allow you to reflect. First of all, I'd like to thank our reflectors, if you will join me in doing that. It's been nice to hear some synthesis on the conversation that's been going on. I'd like to ask Jeff to come up for a second. Your reflection, you actually have a half-hour break, so you can take that any way you want to as far as how you choose to use that time. Jeff?
Great.
Cupcakes, by the way.
Cupcakes, yes. So just one last thing. One of the other things we heard a lot about this morning was the challenge of getting board members to come along with us, because I think Bruce very poignantly said, my board is going to be there for 3 to 5 years, and if it's 10 to 30 years, we're going to be in big trouble. And this is something that we actually created with the site that needed to communicate to their board and multiple boards what made this different. And this idea of moving from charity to investment, not just driven by heart and mind, not numbers served, impact on those served, not the number of initiatives launched, but how do we spread what works along the lines of the FAFSA work, the financial aid work that Wynn talked about, and then not the number of dollars raised, but the social return on investment. And I do think that we heard consistently that getting the board members involved and engaged and owning this is fundamentally critical. So with that, we would just like to say, please bring your haikus up here. Those were fantastic. And I honestly didn't think anybody would actually do that. So that's going to become something we do all the time. And I also left out Steve Patrick. Amazing, right? Let's give Steve a round of applause for all the work that he's done. He was asked as part of the Council on Community Solutions to then just take this thing up, and he had no idea what to do. And then look at this, right? Here we all are. So thanks to everybody. Thanks to our reflectors. Enjoy your sessions this afternoon, and really appreciate your active participation. Thanks a lot.